I'm gonna get started. This is gonna be like really quick. So hello everyone, my name is Tenchi, and I'm gonna be covering the history of PlayStation console hacking. Just a quick overview of myself. I haven't been around a lot, so there's probably some of you that don't know me. I'm basically Chandy's shadow. Not really. But yeah, I'm from Vegas. Hopefully I graduate this semester, or else I don't know what I'm gonna do. I also do U.S. Cyber Team. You can see in the top right. I used to be a SR intern, Google, and now I'm going back to Google in New York City. So that's going to be a lot of fun, exciting. Really quick disclaimer. This is intended for educational purposes only. Please do not violate any licensing agreements and make sure you own the software. I'm not sponsored and opinions are my own. So please do not maliciously hack other people's property. And emulation's bad because I have to say it. Okay, so we're going to cover the 5 consoles that are out currently. So the start, of course, the PlayStation 1, and then we'll gradually move up to present day, which is the PlayStation 5. Yeah. Oh, I guess I'll talk about like sort of the motivation for this talk. One of my first introductions to cybersecurity was like console hacking. Not gonna say what I did, but yeah. So this is kind of the attack surface for consoles. There's a lot of different techniques that we can use to gain access and elevate privileges, bypass protections. So you've got mod chips. Mod chips are usually soldered on directly to the console to read data in transit from the circuit boards and modify them. You kind of got soft mods. So this is typically for CD-ROM disc readers. So when you insert DVDs, there's a couple of modifications that you can do to the console itself physically to bypass some protections, which I'll go into. Custom firmware. So this is a little bit more lower level where you have arbitrary code execution and escalated privileges to rewrite the firmware. So there's a couple of out there for each console. Some are still being maintained. Actually, a lot of them are still being maintained. Binary exploitation. This is like you need to know binary exploitation to be able to do console hacking. Like you need to know reversing. You need to know your techniques, buffer overflows, use after freeze, and then modifying the bootloaders and going into recovery modes. This is quite common. You're intentionally using a sort of like a maintenance port to overwrite existing firmware, but also load into modify the bootloader to load into your own custom menus, let's say. Then of course you've got more serial stuff like JTAG and USB exploits. USB is kind of similar to the bootloaders and recovery modes where you stick a USB in and you can trick the console into going into recovery mode or downgrading the firmware. And then more recently, within these 10 years, it's like open source security, third-party exploits. So for example, WebKit is a big thing since consoles started introducing web browsers. And then save game and peripheral exploits. So save game is relating to existing games that have vulnerable code. And this usually comes in from backwards compatibility. There's an example with the PS4, which is where you have a PS2 game that has a buffer overflow in it, and then you can trigger that buffer overflow to get user land access. And peripheral exploits, think of like Arduinos, ESP32s, directly hooking and acting as the USB. So you can fuzz sort of the USB ports and gain access from there. But this is a general attack surface for consoles. And then we'll go through for each one. So starting with the PlayStation 1 era, so who here has actually seen a PS1, like in real life, or even knows what it looks like? No? Not real? You've seen pictures? Dang, okay, I feel kind of old. So it's a little gray box. I intentionally didn't, use PlayStation images because I don't want to get death threats. But you have like a little port to plug in your controller, and then you have a CD-ROM little thingy. If you remember, if you took trips with your family and you had like the little CD DVD player, it kind of looks like that, but gray. So it was one of the first consoles to use CD-ROMs versus cartridges. Think of N64, NES. So what people in the early days wanted to do, since, of course, PlayStation is a Japanese company, people wanted to play games outside of their region. And there's protections that, that came with the PlayStation 1 era, where PlayStation 1 console, where you could not play games that were outside of your region. And the way that they did this was through this wobble groove check. So in CDs, there's this, the middle part of the circle is a place called a wobble groove. And then outside of that is where you have like different sectors. So you'll have like game data, I think like, not state data, but there's other data in there. So they would, on boot and on insert of the CD, they would check this wobble groove against their own region key that's inside the console. And so what you could do was you could swap the CDs while the game was booting. So you would like stick your finger in the CD-ROM area, and then you would quickly swap it out for a copied game, since CDs were pretty easy to copy back then. So that's one technique. It's a soft mod technique. And then this became harder once PlayStation caught on and they introduced protections. So back then, of course, you didn't really have like OTW, like firmware updates. So over the wire, through the internet, you can't update the firmware once it's been released. And so what they would do is they would introduce new checks that were coded in the game disks. So the mitigations here, like libcrypt. So libcrypt was a 16-bit key that was programmed into the game disk itself, and it would check to see if that existed and has been modified or not. So a famous example of that was Spyro 3, where they did libcrypt plus a different implementation where there were CRC values, so circular CRC checks. It's a checksum, so think of like hashing. And so the PlayStation 1 console was pretty defeated like early on. It had very rudimentary security features, since it was the early days of security, hacking, the internet. And so most updates were introduced via subsequent releases of the console, so new hardware. So coming into the PS2, this is where, again, the PS2 was the best-selling console that PlayStation released. I think a little bit more than the PS4, slightly. And so we still have the usage of DVD, CD swaps, so the technique about switching the real game for the copied game, essentially, and also mod chips where it would bypass the checks entirely. But the biggest thing that's introduced here is modifying the bootloader. So does anybody remember the PS2 extended memory cartridges, like the 8 megs? The 8 megs? Yeah, the little save state files that you have for your games. So basically what you could do is overwrite that cartridge to be one of these loaders. So a famous one was called Free McBoot. So you load Free McBoot onto the PS2 memory card, and then you would load that and run homebrew apps. So homebrew apps are basically just like external applications that you could import. So think like, I don't know, Linux. You can load Linux. Yeah. So there's the introduction of like bootloader hacks where you can load your own menus instead of just PS2. And then going into the PS3, I guess this is more recent with recent in everybody's memory. I think everybody had a PS3 or Xbox 360 at one point. So it was marketed as the unhackable console. There was a lot of hype around this PlayStation 3 with it being advertised to have a very secure hypervisor, which is, for isolating processes. And there was also it was being marketed to have the ability to upload other OSs. So you can install like Linux onto the PlayStation 3. But the Xbox 360 didn't have this, or the Xbox 360 had a security incident where it was pwned so bad that they decided to remove it. That's like a far-fetched theory that you see online. Who knows if it's true or not? They might have just said, "F it, no more Linux for you guys." But following a couple of years, so 1 to 2 years, we see the first sort of break. So we have a USB device called PS Jailbreak. It was sold as a little standalone USB dongle where you would insert, and it would trick the PS3 console into going into recovery mode. And from there, you could straight up just install your own firmware and install third-party apps. Now, arguably, the biggest incident that gained a lot of publicity was the private key leaks of the PS3. And so, does anybody remember this? It was on the news, like, yeah, GeoHots. Really? Really? I did not know that. Wow. Yeah. I hope there's no hate against me when I mention his name here. So during like 2010, or late 2010, George Hotz and Fail Overflow both released the root private keys, or that they have found the root private keys. George Hotz actually accidentally released the root private key because he was making his own loader, which had that hard-coded. And then Fail Overflow, which is like a console hacking group, they just had a presentation that they found the private key. So arguably, George Hotz was not responsible in his disclosure because he just included it in his loaders. So, but yeah, the weakness here was that they implemented ECDSA wrong. So, everybody should know ECDSA. I think it was I don't know if Brad mentioned it, but ECDSA is a type of elliptic curve cryptography, and so it requires a random number generator, but the random number generator just returned the same number every time. So basically, you could just have a bunch of keys being generated, and you could get the private key from there. So yeah, kind of bad. And so this led to like a lot of like homebrewing attempts for the PS3, since you have the root key, so you can basically sign anything and everything. So custom firmware, third-party apps to just straight up load. But yeah, this was pretty big in the early 2010, early 2010s. And then yeah, so PS3 Hen is probably one of the biggest like loaders that came out of this, and it was applicable to any firmware version. So you didn't have to have customized firmware. You didn't have to run any of the exploits. You can just load it straight up. So yeah, pretty cool stuff. Then the PS4 era. So PlayStation kind of learned from all the marketing and the attention that they garnered from the PS3 scandals. So it was pretty secure. They switched over from PowerPC or like RISC architecture consoles to x86, and they started working more with like other board partners to like TSMC. They basically had their own GPUs made for them. So it was very hard. It was there wasn't any like major breakthroughs like in the first 2 years, but then people started attacking other venues. So here's the sort of attack vector with open source software and third-party libraries. So WebKit is a open source browser engine, and so by using known exploits for WebKit, they could chain known WebKit exploits to get userland access, and then also chain known kernel vulnerabilities because PlayStation 4 was running on FreeBSD. And so you have this like new birth of more binary exploitation style tricks to get root access, started moving away from sort of the hardware breaks. So yeah, a kernel exploit chain. So like a full chain would be like you use the WebKit exploit to get to userland, and you would use a different technique that's known within FreeBSD. Like there was BPF race condition and UAF type confusion. So all these leads to writing memory, and that allows you like arbitrary code execution. So the mitigations for this PlayStation 4, it's still being updated to this day. So it's becoming increasingly harder to exploit the new versions because there aren't publicly available exploits. So people tend to stay on their old firmware versions to install homebrew applications, run pirated games. Yeah. And then we get to the PS5. So it's pretty recent since it's released, 2021? But there has been a couple incidents where the security keys were leaked. Sharad mentioned the Flow one. Andy, what was his last name? Andy Nguyen? Yeah, and he does some great research on console hacking. But I think Fail Overflow found the PS5 security keys. I think Andy Nguyen had a different vuln, discovered a different vuln. But you still have WebKit vulns, and because of the web browser present on the PS5. But another great thing is that PlayStation introduced a bug bounty program. So it incentivizes more proper disclosure methods, so we won't have an incidents like GeoHots, where it's just released in the wild. But yeah. So that was kind of the history of PlayStation console hacking. Any questions? Well, nothing is. Well, so the question was, will they get to a point where consoles can't be hacked? I don't think so, since you can't secure everything, and like the industry is more reliant on like open source software and third-party applications to even run like basic web browsers. So I mean, if you go back to like the whole XZ incident, right? It's like you have open source software that's being maintained by who knows what, right? So I don't think there'll ever be a point where everything is secure. If that makes sense. Yep.
On top of Anthony's question, I wouldn't be surprised if like PS5 or maybe like a PS6, they start introducing like trusted computing, like at a station.
Right. Like a TPM chip.
TPMs, just like yeah, just like trust. I don't know what architecture. I think it runs on like MIPS. I don't know.
Mm.
But I wouldn't be surprised if they just start introducing like trusted computing, just for purpose of security.
Right. Yeah. I think that's gonna be.
I
Yeah.
wouldn't be surprised if they start moving towards like more mobile style, where you have like trust zone hypervisors,
Mm.
increasing like defensive depth type mitigations at a hardware level.
Yeah. I think x86. So what Sharad was saying was that the next generation of consoles will introduce more secure hardware, things like TPM, trust zones. But I would add on to that, like, I think consoles are going to start moving towards ARM and back to RISC architectures because of its more, right, so it has more security features like trust zones, the ARM trust zone, and potentially TPM.
What was the like original idea for PlayStation to switch like back to x86? Like from what were they at?
So again, I think like RISC architectures were really popular back in the day, and everybody wanted to make everything in-house. But the more they did everything in-house, the harder it was for like third-party developers to develop their own games. So specifically with the PS3, it was very hard to develop like good games or like to fully utilize the PS3's architecture because they had so many like different features that weren't properly communicated. And so I think by moving to x86, they allowed more third-party developers to, it was just more accessible in a sense to develop games. Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay. Yeah. So that concludes my presentation. It's kind of sad. I was hoping to develop like a whole exploit, but that didn't work because it's really hard to discover exploits for FreeBSD on your own. So yeah, thanks for listening. This is my last presentation, and I hope you guys have a nice rest of the semester. Thanks.